Well, Thierry, thank you, and good evening, everybody. Good evening. I don't want to disappoint anyone after that introduction as a Euro-nihilist, but I'm sorry to say that if you've come along tonight to listen to a rant against all things European, you're in for a terrible disappointment. Because I have to confess, I am married to a European. My wife comes from Hamburg, and living in a German-dominated house has influenced my political thoughts about Europe too. In my life, before getting into politics, I actually had a real job, believe it or not, which is rare. No, for 20 years, I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and off I went to the City of London, and as I tell people, I worked damned hard in the private sector for 20 years, up until lunchtime, every single day. And during that time, just to prove my good European credentials, I did in fact work for 2 French companies. Now it's true, they both sacked me for insubordination, but I'm trying not to bear the grudge. I am not against Europe, for goodness sake. I love Europe. But the Europe that I love is a Europe of diversity, a Europe of culture, a Europe of individual nation states, and we should want to trade together. We should want to cooperate together. We should want to be friends together. But we should cherish that thing that in a nation state is more important than anything else, namely our democratic system and our ability through the ballot box to be the masters of our own destiny. And because of that, I am a sworn opponent, blood opponent of this current European Union, which sets out to destroy the very existence of the nation state. Now, we have to understand where the European Union came from. You know, I'm not one of those people, and you can find the odd conspiracy theorist on the internet who will tell you that this was an evil empire right from the beginning. That somewhere in Brussels, and I was told this when I was first elected, that if I looked hard enough, somewhere in Brussels I would find the villain from the James Bond films, stroking a white cat. You know, planning domination of Europe. No, it wasn't like that. This came to pass because France and Germany 3 times in 70 years went to absolutely destructive and ruinous wars which affected all of us and indeed affected the whole world. There was this feeling in 1945 of what can we do to stop this terrible thing ever happening again. Now that of course is really very understandable and very reminiscent, if you like, of the communist project, which in a way was the big idea of the first half of the 20th century. Communism too was based on good ideas. Communism too was based on idealism, but let's remember that communism finished up actually murdering 40 million of its own people. The European Union was based on a good idea, but it was based on a false premise that completely misunderstood humankind. You see, the idea from Monnet onwards, and indeed the idea that is now championed by my great friend, man I admire enormously, Herman Van Rompuy. More of him later, perhaps, if we get time. But the idea that is being championed is that if you abolish the nation state, then it'll be peace in our time. The idea that is being championed is that it was the existence of nation state that led to war. And the misanalysis is this, that if nation states are democratic, they don't go to war with each other. And that actually attempting to impose a completely artificial and false new sense of identity on people by saying to people, without ever giving them the opportunity, this is your flag, this is your anthem. Oh, and by the way, these 27 unelected commissioners are now your government. That actually, if you do that, far from that being a recipe for peace and harmony, you actually stir up the very seeds of the thing the project was supposed to stop. And it is my very, very strong contention that if the European Union carries on down this current route, it will lead to nationalism, extremism and violence as individual member states have within them terrorist movements that fight to get their own identities back. Ladies and gentlemen, we are heading in completely the wrong direction. And we're heading in the wrong direction because the political class bought into a view and decided that's what we would have. And we have never, any of us in these 27 countries, we have never been told the truth, and we've never been given the opportunity in a free and a fair referendum to decide what's important. And I'm pleased to see that in this country, with a general election coming up in a few days' time, I'm pleased to see that voters, both on the right and the left of the political spectrum, are able to cast a Eurosceptic vote. And I'm pleased to see that the European debate is actually taking place in this country. But I must say to you, I don't think it's anywhere near high enough up the agenda. Frankly, what could be more important than the very question of who governs your nation? And I hope that if anything good does come out from my visit here today, apart from the fact the bar will do terribly well afterwards, I hope that if anything good does come out of this visit today, and thank you very much for inviting me, I hope this helps to get this question higher up the agenda between now and next week. So we know that it was based on a good idea, and I believe that it was based on a false premise. But folks, just look at what it's become. You know, my mum and dad, back in 1975, in a referendum that we had in Britain on whether we should stay part of the common market, that's what it was called, and my mum and dad both voted yes to us having a proper, sensible, free trade relationship with our next door neighbours. Now that is something that I still want today. But nobody told them that it was about political union. Nobody told them that it was about transferring our rights to an unelected bureaucracy in Brussels. And nobody, I don't even think those that believed in the European dream, could have realised what it would actually become. I was elected in 1999 to the European Parliament for an absolutely non-existent party in those days called UKIP. In fact, it's fair to say, I think I was more surprised than anybody that I'd found myself elected. And what a delicious double irony it was at 1:45 in the morning. And there I was on my first ever live TV interview, blinking into the cameras, saying with a delicious double irony how delighted I was to have been elected to a parliament I didn't think should exist under a system that I condemned. But I went there, and my view in those days was purely perhaps a selfish, perhaps a purely nationalistic view. My view was that Britain should simply divorce herself from Europe and the rest of you should just carry on with it. But that is not my view now. My view now is that actually the whole of Europe needs to be freed from what I believe is now an emerging tyranny. For those that think that is rich, for those that think that language is a bit strong, and I'm always very modest and very calm in what I say, as you know from YouTube, but for those that find that a bit rich, let me explain. In the early part of the last decade, there was a constitutional convention. It was actually the moment at which the European project was about to become honest. It already had the attributes of a state, but with the Constitution, it was formally to become a state. And they had their convention, and they produced their report. They decided to absolutely make sure that democracy would not mess up their process. They decided to make absolutely sure that the government of Europe would remain the appointed, unremovable European Commission, unremovable at least by the voters. And of course the French had a referendum on this. And the French said no. And then a few days later, you guys had a referendum on this. And by a thumping 2-to-1 majority, there was a big Eurosceptic no. And I really thought, at that moment, we'd secured a victory. I felt the ship would turn round. I felt we were going to get a different kind of Europe because of a democratic will that was being expressed. And what did we get? We got the same treaty we got the same centralising powers rebranded, repackaged as a Lisbon Treaty, and rammed through national parliaments by the hopeless political class that we all have, and with us being denied referendums. And for me, that was the real pivot point. You know, I was opposed to the project before then, but I've been its sworn opponent ever since. And we've seen specimens of it since. We've seen specimens of it since. The Lisbon Treaty, of course, the beauty of it was no referendums, but one country had to have a referendum, Ireland. And how did the Irish vote? They voted no. And the next day, the very next day, the European Parliament was in session in Strasbourg. I must confess, I walked into the chamber with a remarkable spring in my step that particular morning, and decided I was going to have a jolly good time. And I remember the round of speeches from the group leaders, including a man called Martin Schulz, who some of you may have seen. Others may have had the even deeper misfortune of meeting him, I don't know. But there was Schulz, standing up on behalf of the Party of European Socialists, and in the light of the Irish no, he said, we must not bow to populism. What he meant was, we must not and we will not bow to democracy. And he went further. He said, and he pointed up, of course, at me. I mean, why they always pick me out, I've no idea. He pointed out to me, he said, the no side, and those that support the no side are opening the door to fascism. God, I hate these people. They are the lowest of the low. If anybody is supporting totalitarianism, if anybody is supporting tyranny, if anybody is opening the door to a new kind of fascism or communism, or call it what you will, it is people like Martin Schulz. What we are doing is fighting to get back the ability of democratic nation states to vote for their governments and to have the power to remove their governments, and we will win this great war. The Eurozone project, it was perfectly easy to predict from the first, was going to be a total and utter disaster. How on earth could you possibly put together countries with such diverse economies and business cultures as Germany and Greece? It was obvious from the start that this simply wasn't going to work. And of course, when they launched the euro, we had the fireworks party and the champagne being passed round. And those of us, people like me, that said from the start that it simply would not and could not work, were greeted with the usual round of, you know, we're mentally ill and all the rest of it. But my goodness me, haven't we been proved to be right? And what an unholy mess we have now. We have southern European countries now trapped inside the economic prison of the euro. And I know there's a big political debate about this. And quite rightly, there's a huge economic debate about this. But I tell you what's absent from these people who set this project up saying they were doing it for the good of mankind. Where is the consideration for the human misery that this euro project is causing? They couldn't care less. You know, when I met Angela Merkel last year, just after a Conference of Presidents meeting in the European Parliament, it's delicious, isn't it? They have to invite me to all of these things. I love it, you know. And so I met Chancellor Merkel, and I can share a secret with you, that in private, Chancellor Merkel looks even more miserable than she looks in public. Perhaps that was me, I've no idea. But I said, Chancellor, surely wouldn't it be kinder to your taxpayers who've just spent 20 years having to pay for the reintegration of Eastern Germany into Western Germany, wouldn't it be kinder to them to say that they shouldn't have to go on signing blank cheques in perpetuity? And wouldn't it be a liberation for the Greek people to get out of a currency that they should never have joined in the first place, to have a competitive devaluation, and to give themselves the opportunity of trading their way back to prosperity. But Mr. Farage, she said, we can't let Greece leave the euro. Because if Greece leaves the euro, other countries will leave too. And that will be the end of our European dream. Now, there's a bit of me that says I'll drink to that, but, just think about what she's saying. What she's saying, and what all the European leaders are saying, is they actually couldn't care less if every single person in Greece was forced into poverty and starvation. That doesn't matter as long as they save their European project. We are being led by bad, bad people. And what we are engaging on no side is a fight for liberty, a fight to give the Greeks back an opportunity to get themselves back to prosperity. And for the rest of you, up here in Finland and the Netherlands and in Germany and Northern Europe, you're frankly now shackled to a corpse. You're shackled to something that is now damaging you. And once this ESM treaty goes through, as indeed it will, who knows just how much? Well, let's hope you're right, but who knows how much in terms of taxpayers' money you are going to be in for. You see, not only must we reject this centralized, undemocratic, failing, idiotic, moronic economic model that we've got in Brussels, we've also got to wake up to the fact that there is a big world out there. A big world, a big emerging world out there. Yes, China and India will have their hiccups. But the EU currently represents 18% of the world's GDP. That will halve in the next 10 years. And like the British, you too are a great trading nation with links across the world. How intelligent is it for a trading nation to be forbidden from having the ability to negotiate its own trade deals with any other part of the world? What sensible businessman would think that was a good deal here in Amsterdam, or certainly down the road in Rotterdam, where in my previous life I did so much business? We are being held back by a regulatory model that is making us price uncompetitive against the rest of the world. We are being held up by an obsession with CO2 emissions, and frankly our response to it is making us increasingly uncompetitive against India and China. We need liberation economically. We need liberation politically. I am absolutely convinced that this European project will collapse. The problem is, I think it could take quite a long time. Because on the one hand, you have economic logic that says the euro must break, but on the other, you have the power of the status quo and the political will of those currently in charge. I hope, if even only in a small way, that the Dutch electorate next week vote, whether it's left-wing or right-wing, vote Eurosceptic, and let's put Europe back on the path to sanity. Thank you very much.